Model railroad track can be confusing, especially if you're a beginner. There's a ton of terminology that you will see and you'll be like, what? Let's try and clear some of that up today.
This video is brought to you with support from my patrons on Patreon. These videos would not be possible without them, and if you'd like to join the Patreon community, you can follow the link in the description below and join for as little as $1 a month.
Hey everybody, my name's Jimmy. Still drinking some of that store brand coffee. I've got to get some new coffee. But before we begin, let's talk about some of the coffees that you guys are drinking. William Floyd is drinking Lion Kona Coffee Black. Old Dog is drinking mixture of Maxwell House Bold and Goroka Coffee Highlands Blue from Papua New Guinea. And Jason Kennedy is drinking President's Choice Morning Blend with 1 sugar. If you want to tell me what type of coffee you are drinking and have it mentioned on the show, you can leave it in the comments below and I just might do that. Okay, let's get down to business. There are several key terms that you will hear a lot when it comes to model railroad track. The two biggest ones that are the easiest to confuse are scale and gauge. To put it simply, scale applies to the trains running on the track and gauge applies to the track itself. Scale is the size relationship between a model and its real-world counterpart. So HO scale is 1 to 87 scale, which means that 1 inch equals roughly 87 inches in scale, for example. Gauge is the distance between the rails. For example, the rails for HO gauge track are 0.65 inches or 16.5 millimeters apart. The reason that this distinction is important is that you can use different gauges of track within the same scale. This is most commonly used to model narrow gauge railroads. Sticking with our HO scale examples, the narrow gauge variant HON 30 is still HO scale, but actually uses N gauge track, which is 9 millimeters or 0.353 inches. Two of the most popular variations are ON 30, where HO gauge track is used with narrow gauge O scale models, and OO scale, which is the most popular scale in the UK, which is a 1 to 76 scale that runs on HO gauge track as well. There are also a whole range of scales that run on G gauge track, from 1 to 32 all the way down to 1 to 20.3. This is the most important thing to get right with your model trains, because if your gauge is wrong for your trains, then your trains won't run. They won't even sit on the track. But don't get too worried. The only time this really can become confusing is when you're modeling narrow gauge. The vast majority of trains are going to fit on one of the standard gauges of track, and they're going to run exactly on their scale. So don't worry too much about that. Now, there is something that you will see a lot that can be confusing. What is track code? Track code is the height of the rails. The number that is referenced is related to the height in inches of the track. For example, code 100, a commonly used HO gauge track height, is 1/10 or 0.1 inches high. The most common codes for HO gauge track are code 100, code 83, and code 70. Now, I have a couple of examples here. I have some Bachmann Easy Track that comes with a set that is code 100. I don't know if we can see that right there. And then I also have some Atlas Flex Track that is code 83. And if I can put these together, you can see their rail height is a little different. I may have to scoot this out. Let's see if I can get this in there. There we go. And you can see that it's just barely just a little bit different. So that's the 0.1 inch versus 0.083 inch. That's the height difference right there. So that's what you're talking about when you have the different codes. This is code 100. This is code 83. Now, for all of this, each one of these represents a different type of rail trackage, with the largest representing heavy mainline track and the smallest representing secondary track and sidings. Now, in N scale, there are 3 common codes: code 80, code 70, and code 55. Now, because of N scale size, though, all of these can be used to represent mainline track. Now, let's talk about some of the differences that you will see in the track that you buy. The first and most obvious will be, does it have a roadbed attached to it? And you just saw some of it. Track like Bachmann Easy Track, which it comes in the black bed and the silver bed. We'll talk about that in a second. Cato's Unitrack, which is right here, and it's actually what I use on my layout. And then we also have an O scale or O gauge. We have Lionel's Fast Track right here. So these are all these different ones that you can use. Now the advantage of having a road bed on it like this is that it's a lot easier to lay down the track and install, but one of the disadvantages, the big disadvantage actually, is the lack of realism. Now, one of the other key differences that you will see is what the rails are made of. Now, there are three main metals used to make model railroad track: steel alloy, nickel silver, and brass. Steel alloy is rarely seen outside of Bachmann Easy Track in the black road bed. So if you've seen this, this is typically a steel alloy. Now, if you see HO gauge track and Bachmann Easy Track that has the silver, or not silver, but the gray road bed, that is going to be your nickel silver track. Now, all of Bachmann's in-scale Easy Track is going to be nickel silver, so there's none of that. So it's only in this HO scale with a black road bed. The other one is nickel silver. Now, nickel silver, you're going to see most right here. Cato Unitrack uses that nickel silver, and if you hold them up right next to each other, you can see the slight color variation. This is going to be less susceptible to corrosion than steel track is, which means it's going to need a little bit less maintenance than the steel alloy track, and that's why it's typically favored by most that are building indoors. And brass used to be a very common one, but now it's been mainly relegated to garden railways. It does hold up pretty well when it comes to garden railways, but you also have nickel silver and you have stainless steel out there as well. But a lot of the starter sets and big track companies make their track in brass for garden railways. So if you're starting out, what do I recommend? Well, let's go over common starter set track pack specs. That's really a tongue twister. I should have written that better. Starter set track tends to be the easiest to use and the cheapest to manufacture for the company. So in HO scale, you will see mainly Code 100 in Bachmann sets, or you'll see that steel alloy track, but you're going to see in Easy Track, you're typically going to see Code 100, and you're going to see that in a lot of other starter set track packs. The exception to this is Cato's HO scale track, which is Code 83. Now, they don't do a lot of starter sets with engines and everything, but they do a lot of track packs for HO scale track and Code 83. Now, in scale, you're pretty much going to see a Code 80 in these starter sets all across the board. Code 55 is, I would consider, probably a slightly more advanced, because you're talking about tighter tolerances with in-scale, and it's easier to derail on those shorter rail heights. So you're going to just see Code 80 in all those starter sets. So if you're starting out, a taller rail height is going to give you less of that operating hassle, and this is because it allows for that greater margin of error. So trains that are rolling along and Code 100 for HO and Code 80 for in-gauge track are going to have less issues than the shorter rail heights, which require a bit more precision in their modeling. So Code 100 and Code 80 are going to be your great options for starters. So if you want to use a plastic roadbed, however, I cannot recommend Cato Unitrack enough. I have built I built 4 layouts out of Cato Unitrack, and I've never had major issues with the track. And even the Code 83 stuff is great for HO scale for starters. So this is just really solid. And this is what I consider for HO and in scale. I consider this the gold standard for the plastic roadbed. So if you want to learn more about getting started in model railroading, check out these videos right here. Until next time, I'm Jimmy from the DIY and Digital. Stay safe, be kind, drink some coffee, and happy railroading.